Hey there and welcome back to another Avatar The Last Airbender video. And usually when I make videos on this franchise, I find myself talking through the elements of the show I really enjoy. How it's well written, how successful it was, how it changed the face of animated TV forever, and how its fingerprints can be seen all over many successful animated shows of the 2010s and beyond. Because yeah, it's a great franchise. And I think it really does deserve to be acknowledged as such. But that being said, it isn't a perfect show, and it does have its own flaws. And I'm sure I could sit here rattling them off for you today, but that's not what I really want this video to be about. This video is more aimed at addressing a complaint I've had for a very long time. Not a complaint about bad character development or plot progression, but more a nitpick about a certain aspect of the show. And yeah, once again, this is more tongue-in-cheek than anything else. I'm clearly nitpicking. But it wormed its way into my head a little while ago, and I can't rest until I do something about it and bring it up so I can well and truly get it out of my system. And so yeah, that's what this video is about. My irrational annoyance that somehow Aang is the only airbender left in the world by the time of the events of the show, and how I don't think it actually makes that much sense in reality. And before I go any further, yes, I realise that a lot of narrative potential comes from Aang being the last of his kind, and it really sets up his arc. He's a pacifist who strictly conforms to airbender doctrines of avoidance of conflict. He ran away from his troubles to live the nomad lifestyle, and because of this, his people were wiped out and he wasn't there to help them. He couldn't save them. And thus, he was left as the last airbender in the world when he awakened from his 100-year stasis. And this is a really interesting framework for the story to follow, and it sets up our protagonist as being very unique. He comes from a dead culture. He looks different. His clothes are different. He fights differently, using techniques previously thought to be lost forever. And on top of that, it firmly sets up the Fire Nation to be dangerous and cruel villains. The type of people to carry out a full-on ethnic cleansing simply because they're afraid a child is going to derail their plans for world domination. It makes you hate them and want to see them lose and for the Avatar to triumph. So it's not like I'm just completely missing the point of the story, right? I get it. Thematically and narratively, it was probably the best choice for the direction of the story. It was what his character needed to set itself apart, and is one of those big story points that blends the children's light entertainment side of things with the more mature themes the creators wanted to infuse the story with. I'm not disputing that. Once again, it's just nitpicking the actual genocide itself. Like, how the hell could there not even be a single airbender besides Aang once he returns from the iceberg? How is he the only one? How is his bloodline the only one that existed to carry on airbending after the war? I get that it makes sense thematically, but I don't think it 100% holds up under a more realistic lens. And let's just run through the context of what actually happens. On the day of Sozin's Comet, the Fire Nation unleashes its death squads onto the air temples and apparently wipe out the vast majority of the airbenders. That's fair enough. And in the following years, they lay traps and send out hunters to capture and kill any survivors, and this works. And by the time at the end of the war, there's just Aang. And as a kid, I accepted this reality. I accepted this is what happened and didn't ask any questions. But then as I've gotten older, I do have questions about this whole thing. So, Sozin's Comet was known to empower the Firebenders. It makes them almost invincible against a regular character. Only the most OP benders would realistically have a chance against them. And so I can accept that in the event of an attack, a lot of airbenders would die simply because they're completely outmatched. I accept that. But what I do have trouble with is how they were even caught off guard to begin with. When Aang runs away, we already know that everybody's getting really wary of the Fire Nation. Gyatso tells him that war is on the horizon. Roku found the Fire Nation territories in the Earth Kingdom. They told Aang he was the Avatar at age 12 instead of 16 in order to try and prepare him earlier than usual. So for one, they knew Sozin was up to something. And they knew it didn't seem like he was stopping. And surely they would also be aware that a massive comet with firebender empowering abilities is on the way. If the Fire Nation could figure that out, surely they'd have this ability too, right? The air nomads seem like the type of people who would love to stargaze. Surely they'd know. And on top of this, they have a territory that is off the coast of the Fire Nation. A Fire Nation that is known to be aggressive and expansionist. And yet still, they manage to get completely caught with their pants down and almost get completely and utterly wiped out. Whew. So already that does stretch my belief that the nomads would just not expect something bad to happen and not have a contingency in place. Especially since surely it was rumoured that Roku died with Sozin present. Did his widow just not tell anybody that the Fire Lord suspiciously flew off on his dragon and Roku died that day? It reeks of foul play. So not only do they know that the Fire Nation is hungry for conquest, but they know they've already invaded the Earth Kingdom before and annexed territories. And they can suspect that Sozin probably had a hand in Roku's death. And therefore, you'd think they'd realise that this means Aang has a massive target on his back, and therefore, the airbenders have massive targets on all their backs. And on top of that, like I said earlier, you would expect that a culture like this would notice a magical comet coming. I kind of always just put this down to them being nomadic monks with their heads in the clouds, and therefore they just didn't expect a war was going to break out, but looking back, they clearly do know. And yet somehow they were just completely unprepared. But okay, that aside, what happens happens. They get invaded by the Fire Nation who's planning to wipe them out, and regardless of whether they really should have seen it coming, or at least seen an attack coming if they didn't expect a genocide, which is fair enough, I wouldn't expect it, but I'd definitely expect to get invaded. It happens and the temples fall, and the entire population is wiped out. But hey, maybe some escape, and honestly this would be a very real possibility. I think the bison should be able to outfly war balloons, and so even if a bunch of bison do get shot down as they try to escape, you'd think that some would actually slip through the blockade. And considering Aang's perspective on violence and fighting, I doubt all of them would just stand and fight. Many of them, I would expect, would grab some kids and hop on a bison to try and escape. I know that's what I'd be doing if I was a largely pacifistic monk. And maybe some weren't even at the temples to begin with. After all, they're called the air nomads for a reason. So I find it doubtful that they'd all be at the temples to begin with. But then on the other hand, I guess it is more likely that the air nomads probably had the smallest population of all the nations, as they kept more segregated temple lifestyles, less opportunity for procreation, so maybe only a small percentage of these nomads actually survived. And so, maybe there aren't that many left alive, a couple dozen maybe, perhaps less. But then these characters, they also just die off too? None of them are able to successfully avoid getting brutally slaughtered? Really? This is the part that boggles my mind, because wouldn't you go somewhere safe if you were being hunted and ethnically cleansed? It's one thing if they had to walk. They'd definitely be caught then. But you can fly. After all, they're airbenders. Surely even if they didn't have a bison, you could make a makeshift glider. And so we're going to assume that some can. Wouldn't you flee and try to go somewhere that has a better chance of keeping you alive? I mean, by the time of Aang's return, the Earth cities of Omashu and Ba Sing Se, they're still around. They haven't been conquered yet. That happens during the show. Wouldn't places like this be a very logical spot to go and hide? And then yeah, they'd probably have to intermingle with the population, and therefore, not every child of their next generation would even be an airbender. But I feel like surely there would be enough to be getting on with. Enough to re-establish some sort of foothold of a population. And that's just 2 places. There are so many regions that we see are untouched by the war so far, even 100 years on. So I find it surprising there's not one single pocket of airbenders left in the world. And hey, maybe it is easy to believe. Maybe you think I'm wrong. That's all good. This is just one of those topics that really swirls through my head now and again. And I think it would have created an interesting storyline for Aang. That in the years he's been gone, that old monk way of life, that's been extinguished. And so whilst airbenders still live on, it's not the same. The culture's completely different. They're basically Earth Kingdom people that can bend air. They don't give a shit about being a monk or being a pacifist or a vegetarian or anything of that sort. The culture's moved on. It's evolved. And now Aang needs to try to come to terms with all this happening to him, as if his entire heritage shifted gears overnight and is no longer recognizable. Kind of like his story arc with the Mechanist. But probably even sadder than that, as it would be what he views as his people turning their back on his heritage, on him, as opposed to outsiders bastardizing it themselves. So yeah, I don't really 100% buy the whole airbender genocide. Like yes, it makes sense for the story, but when I think too hard about it, it does make me squint my eyes a little bit and wonder how the hell literally none of them managed to avoid getting turned to ashes. But once again, try not to take this too seriously. It's more of an overanalyzed nitpick than an actual true complaint. The Last Airbender is my shit, after all. But anyway, that's the end of the video, and I would like to say that these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think about the whole air nomad genocide story thread? Think it's fine as is, or do you think in hindsight maybe it should have been handled a little differently and has a fair few plot holes? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.